Hi, this is Dr. Owen Rees. In this brief video I'm going to talk about the OCR A-level specifications. In particular I want to focus on the in-depth study option of the politics and society of ancient Sparta 478 to 404 BC. Now, Sparta is one of those topics that certainly sells itself. If you have concerns about how to engage students, especially new students with limited knowledge of the ancient world, maybe you're thinking of introducing ancient history for the first time in a new school, these kind of groups, Sparta is by far your best option. Sparta has captured the imagination of recent generations, especially since the recent film 300 was released, which was by 2003. Now, I am aware, you will be aware, your students are not really old enough anymore to care about that film. But that film has gone on to influence the portrayal of both the Spartans and the Greeks more generally in video gaming, comics, graphic novels, television, and so on. Basically all forms of modern pop culture. If the ancient Greeks are in it, you can almost guarantee that the film 300 or the Spartans themselves have influenced it in some way. Ultimately, the Spartans are in the public eye and people love it. In terms of teaching, the Spartans offer you flexibility. If you have a class who are interested in military history, Spartan military action is in abundance from the Persian Wars right through to the Peloponnesian War, with both great victories and brutal defeats. If your class is more interested in gender, the female Spartans are a worthwhile study in their own right. They own property, had multiple sexual partners, they're educated in athletics and other non-domestic pursuits, very unusual for the ancient Greek world, and kind of allows you to engage with some really interesting discussions. Were they liberated? Is this a liberated female group, or are they just being oppressed in a different way? Now, while you can't avoid all the topics in the syllabus, of course you can't, you can at least use the elements that capture the imagination of your class to frame other areas of study. Similarly, you have the option of teaching Sparta through a comparison, comparing Sparta with their great political rivals of Athens. This kind of contrast helps students focus on the differences and the similarities between things like ancient democracy in Athens and oligarchy in Sparta, the difference between having a military land power versus a strong naval power, helot slavery versus chattel slavery. You can even look at individuals like the Spartan commander Brasidas and ultimately his victim Thucydides, the man who writes the history of the Peloponnesian Wars, or the majority of it anyway. Also, if your students are very discerning, maybe even a bit cynical, you know the kind of ones I mean, Sparta offers an amazing introduction to important historical skill sets, which is what I'll sort of spend the rest of this short talk going through now. The Mirage has evolved since Francois Ollier first coined the term. It is now not just about the poor source material, but also about the myth that has persisted about the Spartans up to the modern day. I'm just going to show you one very simple example that actually just falls outside of the time remit of this syllabus. We're going to look at the Battle of Thermopylae. This is the Greek stand at the pass against the Persian army, as told by the Greek historian Herodotus. I'll ask you a simple question. How many Spartans were at the Battle of Thermopylae? Now, conventionally, it is 300, hence the film title that you see on the screen. Now, if I wanted to be annoying, I would say there's actually another source from Diodorus of Sicily, who actually gives us a completely different number. But we'll stick with Herodotus's account, his number of 300. But is it? This is what Herodotus tells us. He, Leonidas, now came to Thermopylae with the appointed 300 he had selected, all of whom had sons. It's quite subtle, but did you spot it? He tells us Leonidas takes 300 Spartans, so you need to include Leonidas, their commander, in this number. There were surely 301 Spartans at Thermopylae. You know, this is a very minor point. It's just a bit of fun, really, but it gets students thinking. Well, if that small piece of information that has permeated all of our understanding and the way we conceive Sparta, the famous 300, if that is so obviously slightly wrong, what else is wrong? Critical engagement with both the sources and the scholarship is key to what Spartans offer us in the classroom. This does not need to be in depth in any way. It doesn't have to get overly philosophical. It can be as simple as asking a question every time a statement, every time a claim or a source is mentioned by someone. And that question is, what date does that idea come from? To put this plainly, these are our two best literary sources about Spartan society. On the left, you have Xenophon, an Athenian writer writing in the 4th century BCE. He's a man who befriended a Spartan king, Agesilaus. He spent time with the Spartan army, and after he was exiled from Athens, he actually lived on Spartan land for a period of time. He is an eyewitness, but he is not a Spartan. Yet his most important works for us here are the Constitution of the Spartans and a biography he wrote, more of a eulogy really, to the king Agesilaus after the king died. That's Xenophon. On your right you have Plutarch. Plutarch was from Boeotia. He's writing in the 1st and into the 2nd century CE. He had access to a lot of ancient literature that actually we no longer do. It's particularly useful for this, but he often neglects to name his sources, which can be very frustrating. He wrote many biographies of leading Spartan figures. He also accumulated a large list of famous Spartan sayings, including a really interesting list of sayings of Spartan women. If you want to get students thinking about the source material just from a very simple perspective, Xenophon here is surely a primary source. I don't think anyone can argue otherwise. But what does that make Plutarch? I can't really stress this enough when it comes to Sparta. An ancient source, like Plutarch, does not equal a primary source. Now, you may think, surely with the two sources laid out like this, Xenophon is the better source. Of course he is. He is contemporary. He knew Sparta, he knew Spartans. Plutarch actually gives us quite a theme park version of Sparta, a make-believe Sparta filled with superhuman feats, witty comebacks in the face of adversity, because he was writing over 500 years later than this period we are looking at. Yet if you look at some of the most famous elements of Spartan culture, they often derive from Plutarch's work. For instance, the throwing of imperfect babies from a cliff, the secret police force of the Crypteia hunting helots is most categorically defined in Plutarch, described in Plutarch. Even really famous sayings of Spartans come from Plutarch. But from a historical perspective, if they only come from Plutarch, or if there's no earlier source that we can identify he may have got it from, we need to always ask this question: are these stories even valid? This is what the Spartan Mirage offers us in the classroom. A claim can be made or read or remembered from something a student's read, and you can ask, who wrote that? When was that written? And then of course you've got the follow-up. Do you actually believe it? Does it sound plausible? What do you actually think? Spartan history is a perfect way to get students to stop believing everything they're reading all the time. You can get them to critically engage in both with scholarship and with the source material, and indeed with each other. They can disagree on this. So I mentioned phrases, I've mentioned quotes. So I'll leave you with one last thing just to consider as you consider the Spartan syllabus. There's a famous quote, and it is expressed in English in the film 300 as well. We see Leonidas refuse to lay down his army's weapons. Xerxes' messenger gives the order, lay down your weapons, and Leonidas refuses. He says two simple words in Greek, molon labe, translation, come and get them. Except he actually didn't. The story comes from, you may have guessed, Plutarch, and occurs in an exchange of letters, which is very anachronistic. I won't go into that now, but it is very anachronistic, the idea of letter exchange in battle. This is not a verbal exchange as it is portrayed in the film. It is not a verbal exchange as was the norm in classical Greek or late archaic Greek warfare. Earlier accounts, like Herodotus, don't have Leonidas and Xerxes meet or communicate at all. Those that do are much later in date. Remember, dates are the sources. Always, what's the date of that source? And these later sources offer much longer, less succinct responses. Why do I bring this quote up? I bring it up for a couple of reasons. The first is because ultimately it's most likely a made-up story, but a very famous one. But there is another reason why. On your screen now is a meme that kind of embodies a lot of a rhetoric in the US around gun activism and gun control. As it says, at Thermopylae 1 million Persians lost 20,000 men, yet failed to disarm just 300 Spartans. Note, not 301. Americans would resist even harder. From our cold dead hands, molon labe, come and get them. Or would you rather this? Rather blunter point. Gun control, molon labe. There's no kind of grey area here. But what I'm showing you here, you can dismiss. These are just memes. You know, what does a meme really mean in the wider world? Well, let's look at something instead. This was during a period just before Donald Trump's impeachment. They stormed the proceedings. A group of Republican supporters and politicians stormed it, and afterwards gave a stand and gave a press conference in which they described themselves not just like the Spartans, not just like the 300 at Thermopylae, but specifically like Gerard Butler in the film 300 at Thermopylae. This is not the history, this is the mirage they are calling upon. Now it's kind of unfair to just look at the Americans. We can't let our own politicians off here in the UK. If you remember earlier in the Brexit referendum, a lot of the hardcore Brexiteers quickly became banded as the Spartans. Why am I showing you this? The reason why I'm showing you this is because I want you to understand what the Mirage offers, but also to understand what happens when people challenge you, as they may well do, on the relevance, on the importance of doing something like this. Why should my child do something like this? The political engagement, the use of the Spartan imagery, the Mirage. Do not let anyone tell you ancient history is not relevant to the modern world. And one of the best ways to equip your students is to have them engage specifically with the Spartan Mirage and see it for what it was, and as you've seen, what it continues to be to this very day. Thank you very much.